Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Today, we delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the silent peaks have concealed for over a century a mystery that shook an entire community and challenged the very foundations of local faith. Share where you are watching from and prepare yourself, because the fate of the Wren family in 1925 remains unanswered to this day. The Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina have always been a place of wild beauty and profound isolation. At the dawn of the 20th century, this rugged region existed as a world apart, where communities lived in seclusion, separated by deep valleys and seemingly endless dense forests. Roads were little more than dirt paths, and many families went weeks without encountering a stranger. Here, the church dictated not only spiritual life, but also the social rhythm. Sundays were sacred, and an absence from worship never went unnoticed. In this closed world, everyone knew each other, and news spread like wildfire across dry brush. The Wren family was well known in the area. The patriarch, Thomas Wren, was a 42-year-old carpenter, a robust man of few words, who had built with his own hands the home he shared with his wife and 4 children. His wife, Martha, age 38, was described by neighbors as a devout woman who never missed services at the small Baptist church located about 3 miles from their property. Their children were 16-year-old Sarah, 13-year-old Jacob, 10-year-old Emma, and the youngest, Samuel, who was just 7. They were an ordinary, hard-working family, integrated into the community. Nothing in their simple lives suggested something extraordinary and terrible was about to occur. It was autumn when the first strange signs emerged. October of 1925 brought an early cold to that part of Appalachia. The trees had already lost half their leaves, and a steady wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Against this backdrop, the Wren family simply vanished from plain sight. Their absence was not immediately noticed, as people in those lands lived with a certain autonomy, and a few days of seclusion raised no alarm. But when Sunday arrived, and the Wrens failed to appear at church, concern began to grow. Reverend Elijah Stone, leader of the local congregation, was the first to take note. Martha Wren was never absent. She was one of the most devoted, always arriving early with her children and participating in all activities. Her absence was inexplicable. The following Monday, the Reverend decided to pay a visit. He took his wagon and traveled the winding road leading to the Wren homestead. The path was steep, lined with tall pines that blocked the sunlight. Upon arrival, the silence was absolute. No smoke rose from the chimney. There was no sound of children playing or tools at work, only the wind and the creak of dry branches. The Reverend knocked on the door. No one answered. He called out for Thomas and Martha, but his words were lost in the cold morning air. He tried the door and found it unlocked, which was strange, because even in that quiet region, families typically locked their homes when leaving. He pushed the door open slowly, and what he found inside left him utterly baffled. The house was in perfect order. Clean plates were stacked on the kitchen table. Clothes were folded on a chair. Firewood was neatly arranged beside the stove. Everything appeared normal, as if the family had stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about that normality, as if time had frozen inside the home. The Reverend searched every room. The bedrooms were tidy, the beds made. There were no signs of a struggle, desperation, or a hasty departure. The family's clothing remained in the wardrobes. Shoes were lined up near the door. Even the children's toys were arranged neatly in a corner. It was as if the Wrens had simply evaporated, leaving behind all their worldly possessions. A shiver ran down the Reverend's spine. He exited the house and scanned the surroundings. The barn was closed. Chickens scratched freely in the yard. A cow wandered in the pasture, clearly in need of milking. Everything pointed to a sudden, unprepared disappearance. Elijah Stone returned to town immediately and gathered men from the congregation. They returned to the Wren property that same afternoon and began searching the area. They combed the surrounding forest, followed trails into the mountains, and checked nearby streams. They found nothing. No trace, no clue, no indication of where a family of 6 could have gone. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. The news spread rapidly, and soon dozens joined the search. Yet as days passed, the mystery only deepened. County authorities were notified. Sheriff Andrew Caldwell arrived at the property a week after the disappearance. He was an experienced man, familiar with cases of people lost in the mountains. But this was different. This was not a single hunter who had strayed. It was an entire family that had vanished from their own home, taking nothing with them. The sheriff questioned neighbors, examined the property in detail, and inspected every room. His conclusion was disconcerting. There was no evidence of foul play, yet there was also no logical explanation for the disappearance. It was as if the Wrens had chosen to vanish, but left everything behind. Theories soon began to circulate. Some church members suggested the family had fled from a threat. Others whispered of hidden debts or problems Thomas Wren had concealed. There were those who believed they had been kidnapped by criminals roaming the mountains. But none of these explanations fit perfectly. Why leave everything behind? Why not take clothes or provisions? And why had no one seen or heard anything that night? The questions multiplied, and answers remained elusive. Sheriff Caldwell deepened his investigation. He interviewed everyone connected to the Wrens, no matter how distantly. Speaking to local merchants, he uncovered something intriguing. In the week before the disappearance, Thomas Wren had visited the grocery store and purchased an unusual quantity of supplies: flour, salt, dried meat, candles, and matches, enough for several weeks. The grocer, Harold Brennan, remembered it clearly because he found it strange. Thomas never bought so much at once. When asked if he was preparing for winter, Thomas merely nodded and left quickly, without his usual friendly exchange. This information shifted the investigation. If Thomas had bought provisions, he might have been planning something. But what? And where were those supplies now? The sheriff returned to the Wren house and searched every corner, closet, and trunk. He found only normal household groceries, none matching the quantity Thomas had purchased. The provisions had disappeared along with the family. This suggested a planned departure, yet it contradicted the fact that clothes, shoes, and personal items were left behind. The paradox was maddening. Each discovery only thickened the mystery. Meanwhile, the community crafted its own narratives. The church became the center of speculation. Conversations before and after Wednesday and Sunday services revolved solely around the Wrens. Reverend Stone tried to maintain calm and faith, preaching trust in divine providence, but even he was visibly shaken. Martha Wren had been one of his most dedicated parishioners. He had known her for years, baptized her children, and visited their home countless times. The thought that something terrible had befallen the family tormented him day and night. It was during one church meeting that a disturbing detail surfaced. An elderly woman named Agnes Fowler, who lived alone in a cabin roughly 2 miles from the Wren property, revealed something she had initially deemed unimportant. On the Saturday night, 2 days before the absence was noticed, she had heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the Wren home, multiple voices, as if from a meeting or gathering. She found it peculiar because the Wrens rarely had visitors, especially at night. As the voices eventually ceased, she simply went to sleep and forgot the episode. Agnes Fowler's revelation changed everything. If there were other people at the Wren house that night, who were they, and what did they want? Sheriff Caldwell immediately pursued this new lead. He questioned all neighbors about seeing any strangers in the area during those days. Most had noticed nothing unusual, But a farmer named William Garrett recalled seeing 3 men on horseback traveling along the road leading into the mountains on Sunday morning. He could not make out their faces due to the distance, but he thought it strange because that road led only to abandoned trails and remote mountain areas. The investigation gained renewed urgency. The sheriff organized an expedition to follow that road and explore the most isolated parts of the Appalachians. He gathered 10 men, all experienced in navigating the mountains, and set out searching for any sign that could explain the Wren's fate. They rode for days, climbing steep trails, crossing icy streams, and investigating abandoned huts and hidden caves. The mountains were vast and unforgiving, a place where it was easy to get lost, and even easier to vanish without a trace. Nevertheless, they pressed on. On the 3rd day, the group made a discovery. In a remote clearing about 15 miles from the Wren property, they found signs of a recent campfire. The ashes were still slightly warm, indicating someone had camped there within the past few days. Around the fire, they found food scraps, an empty can that had held preserved meat, and, most disturbingly, pieces of torn fabric resembling children's clothing. The sheriff carefully collected the fragments. Upon returning to town and showing the cloth to women in the congregation who knew the Wren family well, confirmation came like a blow to the stomach. The fabric was identical to that of a dress young Emma often wore. The discovery evoked a mix of hope and terror. Finally, there was a concrete clue. Yet what did the torn fabric mean? People's minds raced to the darkest possibilities. Had there been violence? Were the children hurt? Or worse? The sheriff tried to keep the investigation focused on facts, but speculation spread through the community like wildfire. Fear took hold. If something terrible had happened to the Wrens, were other families in danger? Caldwell decided to return to the clearing with more men and experienced trackers. They searched every inch of the area. They found horse tracks, footprints from men's boots, and, most unsettlingly, small footprints that could have belonged to children. The tracks led toward an even more remote part of the mountains, where the terrain became nearly impassable. They followed as far as they could, but eventually lost the trail in a rocky stream bed. It was as if those being followed knew exactly how to vanish without a trace. Frustration was palpable. Each step forward seemed to lead to a new dead end. The sheriff remained determined, but even he began to feel the weight of failure. Weeks had passed since the disappearance. The chances of finding the Wren family alive diminished with each day. Autumn was fading, and soon winter would arrive with its characteristic brutality in those mountains. If the Wrens were lost or trapped in some remote location, their chances of survival were slim. It was in this context of growing despair that a new witness emerged, a hunter named Josiah Mercer, who spent long periods alone in the mountains tracking deer and bear, came to town with a disturbing account. He said that roughly 3 weeks earlier, while hunting in an extremely isolated region of Appalachia, he had come across an unfamiliar cabin. It was a crude structure of ill-fitting logs, hidden in a deep valley surrounded by steep cliffs. He approached cautiously and heard voices inside men arguing in low, urgent tones. Being a prudent man, Josiah decided not to approach further and quietly left the area. He had not given the episode much thought until he heard about the Wren's disappearance. Josiah Mercer's story provided a new direction. Could that unknown cabin be the key to unraveling the mystery? The sheriff immediately asked Josiah to lead him there. The next day, a group of 8 armed men set out for the mountains, guided by the hunter. The journey was arduous. They rode for hours, traversing increasingly difficult terrain until Josiah indicated they were close. They dismounted and continued on foot, descending a steep slope covered in damp leaves. There, hidden among dense trees and rocks, stood the cabin. It was exactly as Josiah had described, a precarious, hastily built structure of piled logs with hardened clay filling the cracks. There were no windows, only a low door made of irregular planks. The place exuded abandonment and secrecy. Sheriff Caldwell signaled the men to approach cautiously, weapons ready. The surrounding silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a stream and the rustle of leaves underfoot. When they were close enough, the sheriff knocked on the door and announced his presence. No answer came from within. He pushed the door open. It creaked on rusty hinges, and he entered. The interior was almost completely dark. One of the men lit a lantern, and its dim light revealed the cabin's contents. What they saw left them speechless. Clear signs indicated several people had been there recently. Dirty blankets lay scattered on the earthen floor. Empty food cans were piled in a corner. Remnants of a campfire sat in the center of the hut, and the smell of smoke still hung in the air. But most disturbing were the personal items scattered about. A clearly handmade rag doll, a small child's shoe, a wooden comb with strands of dark hair still attached. The sheriff picked up the doll and examined it carefully. It was simple, sewn from fabric scraps. He had seen Martha Wren sewing similar dolls for her daughters during church meetings. There was no doubt the Wren family had been in that cabin. But when and where were they now? The men searched every corner for additional clues. They found more torn clothing, a blanket with dark stains that could have been blood, and pieces of cut rope. The atmosphere inside the cabin was stifling, charged with something indefinable yet deeply felt by all. The sheriff ordered the men to search the surroundings. They fanned out into the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of where the cabin's occupants might have gone. It was during this search that one of the men, a young farmer named Daniel Hutchkins, made a discovery that chilled everyone's blood. Approximately 100 yards from the hut, partially concealed under a heap of leaves and branches, was a freshly dug grave. The earth was freshly turned and damp, clearly disturbed not long ago. The men gathered around that somber mound in the mountains, none wanting to believe its grim implication. Sheriff Caldwell gave the order. They had to know what was buried there. 2 men began digging with the shovels they had brought. The soil gave way easily, still soft and not fully settled. They dug for about half an hour until one shovel struck something solid. Not rock, but wood. They cleared the surrounding earth to reveal crude crate lids made of poorly sawn boards. With his heart pounding, the sheriff ordered them opened. The planks were removed one by one, and when they finally saw inside, relief and confusion mixed in a strange way. They were not bodies, but objects, clothing, tools, some books, silverware, bronze candlesticks, pocket watches, items of value that clearly did not belong to a single family. These were things that appeared to have been stolen from several different households. The sheriff began piecing the puzzle together. That cabin was not just a hideout. It was a meeting place for thieves, likely a gang operating in the mountains, burglarizing isolated properties and hiding their loot in remote locations. But how did the Wrens fit into this? Were they victims of these criminals, or was something more complex at play? The investigation took a completely new turn. The sheriff took some of the found objects back to town and began showing them to people, trying to identify the owners. Within days, several families in the area recognized their belongings. There was a set of silverware belonging to the Morrison family, who lived 12 miles to the south, a gold watch belonging to Mr. Whitfield, a prosperous farmer who had reported a theft months earlier, and candelabra from the Methodist Church in a neighboring town. The list grew, and with it, the understanding that a criminal network had been operating in the region for months, perhaps years, without anyone connecting the dots. Yet this still didn't explain the Wrens' disappearance. If they had been victims of this gang, where were their bodies? Why were their clothes and personal effects scattered in the cabin? And why had no one else been found, alive or dead? Sheriff Caldwell began to consider a possibility he did not want to accept. What if the Wren family was not merely victims, but somehow involved with the criminals? The idea seemed absurd. Thomas Wren was a respected carpenter. Martha, a devout woman. But then, how to explain the provisions purchased before the disappearance? How to explain that they had left everything behind except those supplies? The church reacted with outrage to the mere suggestion that the Wrens might be involved in criminal activity. Reverend Stone publicly defended the family, stating he had known Martha for years and that she was incapable of dishonesty. He argued that the Wrens were clearly victims, possibly kidnapped and forced into something against their will. But not everyone in the congregation agreed. Some members began recalling small, once insignificant details. Thomas was always discreet about his finances, rarely spoke of his work, and in the months before the disappearance had become even more reserved, almost evasive in conversation. It was then that an anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It was handwritten in a shaky script and read, "Look in the Wren barn under the floorboards. The truth is hidden where no one has looked." The message was vague and could have been a prank, but Caldwell had nothing left to lose. He returned to the Wren estate with 2 trusted men and went straight to the barn. The place had been inspected before, but only superficially. This time they examined every inch, and under the loose floorboards, just as the letter indicated, they found something that changed everything. There was a hollow space beneath the barn floor, and inside, carefully hidden in burlap sacks, were more stolen objects: jewelry, silver coins, documents belonging to other people. There was also a notebook, a diary written in Thomas Wren's handwriting. The sheriff picked up that notebook with trembling hands and began to read. What was written there was a partial confession, a fragmented narrative revealing a truth far darker and more complex than anyone could have imagined. Thomas had written about huge debts he had incurred years earlier when he tried to expand his carpentry business and failed miserably. He owed money to dangerous men who would not accept excuses or delays. That was when he was approached by someone offering a way out, a means to pay off his debts quickly. All he had to do was use his skill as a carpenter to build secret hideouts on properties that would be stolen. He would be paid for each job, and his family would be safe. Thomas accepted. For months, he indirectly participated in robberies, constructing hidden compartments where thieves temporarily hid their loot. But then something went wrong. The diary did not make clear exactly what, but Thomas wrote that he had been discovered. Someone had noticed his involvement. He panicked. He wrote that he needed to disappear, to take his family away before something terrible happened. The last diary entries were chaotic, written in haste. He mentioned a meeting that needed to happen. He mentioned names represented only by initials. And then, abruptly, the diary ended. The final sentence, scrawled in hurried, nearly illegible handwriting, said only, "They promised they would let us go if I handed over everything. God protect us." The discovery of the diary shattered everything the community believed about the Wrens. Sheriff Caldwell read and reread those pages, trying to extract every shred of information possible. The entries revealed a tormented man caught between fear and despair. Thomas had become involved with criminals out of necessity, but clearly regretted it. His words showed a father trying to protect his family from consequences he himself had caused. But that last sentence was the most disturbing. They promised they would let us go if I handed over everything. Who were they? What was Thomas supposed to deliver? And why had no one seen or heard from the family since? Reverend Stone was devastated when he learned the diary's contents. He had defended the Wrens with all his might, swearing they were people of integrity. Now he faced the harsh reality that Thomas had hidden a dark side of his life. During the next service, the church was full. everyone wanted to hear what the Reverend had to say about this shocking turn. Stone took the pulpit with a tired face and red eyes. He spoke of forgiveness, of how even the most devout people can fall into temptation under desperate circumstances. He asked the congregation not to judge Thomas harshly, but to pray for the family's safety wherever they were. But not everyone was willing to forgive. Some church members felt betrayed. After all, the Wrens had sat among them, had communed beside them, while hiding terrible secrets. The families who had been robbed were especially bitter. Mrs. Morrison, whose silverware had been found in the grave near the cabin, confronted the Reverend publicly. She demanded to know if the church had truly known the Wrens, or if they had all been deceived. Tension in the community grew, dividing neighbors and even families. The Wren mystery was no longer just about a disappearance. It was about broken trust and the fragility of appearances. Meanwhile, Sheriff Caldwell continued his investigation with renewed vigor. He now had a starting point. If Thomas was involved with a gang, there were others who knew the truth. He began investigating all robberies in the region over the past 2 years. A pattern emerged. The stolen properties were always isolated, away from neighbors. The thieves acted with precision, knowing exactly where to find valuables, and in several cases, there were signs that someone knew the house layouts well. This confirmed Thomas's role as an informant or facilitator. The sheriff decided to focus on the initials mentioned in the diary. Thomas had written about a man identified only as J.R. in several entries. This J.R. seemed to be the gang's leader or organizer. Caldwell began looking for any man with those initials who had passed through the area recently. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, asking for information about known criminals or fugitives with those initials. It took weeks, but eventually a reply came from a county deep in Appalachia to the west. There was a man wanted for various crimes in Tennessee and Kentucky. His name was James Ridgway. He was about 35 years old, described as tall and thin with a facial scar and a reputation for extreme violence. Ridgway was known for leading small groups of criminals who robbed farms and then disappeared into the mountains for months. He was clever, never left witnesses alive when he deemed it necessary, and had an almost supernatural ability to vanish without a trace. The description perfectly matched the profile of a man who could have coerced Thomas Wren. Caldwell felt he was finally nearing the truth. He organized a larger operation, enlisting help from sheriffs in neighboring counties, and even some bounty hunters who knew the mountains intimately. Their goal was to find James Ridgway and any members of his gang. But the mountains were vast, and men like Ridgway knew how to hide. Weeks turned into months. Winter arrived in full force, bringing heavy snow and brutal temperatures. The search had to be temporarily suspended. No one could survive in the mountains during that winter without adequate shelter. It was during that harsh winter that the community began to slowly process what had happened. Conversations by fireplaces and at church meetings constantly revolved around the Wrens. Some believed the family was dead, victims of Ridgway and his men. Others thought Thomas had made a deal, and they had all fled to some distant place, perhaps out west, where they could start over with false identities. There were even those who believed in more elaborate scenarios involving betrayals within the gang itself and disputes over hidden money. Young Sarah Wren, the eldest daughter, became an object of special concern. She was 16 when she disappeared. Some women in the congregation whispered quietly about the dangers a young woman would face at the hands of men like Ridgway, a thought no one wanted to fully voice, but one that hung in the air like a dark shadow. Reverend Stone tried to keep hope alive by preaching about miracles and divine protection, but even his faith was tested by the prolonged absence of any news. When spring finally arrived in 1926, bringing the thaw and the return of migrating birds, the search began again. Sheriff Caldwell was more determined than ever. He organized systematic expeditions, dividing the mountains into sections and scouring each methodically. They found more abandoned cabins, more signs of recent camping, but nothing that led directly to Ridgway or the Wrens. It was as if everyone had been swallowed by the green immensity of the mountains. Then, in April of that year, something finally happened. A shepherd, taking his sheep to higher pastures, found human remains in a deep ravine, hidden among steep rocks. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, partially covered by melting snow and leaves. The sheriff was called immediately. Upon examining the remains, his heart tightened. The deteriorated clothes and few belongings nearby suggested it could be Thomas Wren. There was a leather belt with engraved initials matching Thomas's, and near the body, half buried in mud, a pocket watch that several in the congregation recognized as his. The news spread through the community like lightning. At last, there was an answer, partial and terrible. Thomas Wren was dead. But where were Martha and the children? Thomas's body showed no clear signs of violence, but after so many months exposed, it was impossible to determine the exact cause of death. It could have been a gunshot, a stabbing, or even exposure. What was clear was that he had died in that ravine, likely trying to escape from someone or something. The location was significant. The ravine was less than 3 miles from the cabin where the stolen objects had been found. Reverend Stone organized a funeral. Though they could not bury the body properly due to its condition, the church was packed. People from all over the region attended, not only to pay respects, but because the Wren mystery had become part of the community's identity. During the sermon, Stone spoke of redemption and how all men, no matter their mistakes, deserve mercy in death. He prayed for Thomas's soul, and especially for the safety of Martha, Sarah, Jacob, Emma, and Samuel, wherever they were. Many cried, not just for Thomas's confirmed death, but for the torturous uncertainty surrounding the rest of the family. After Thomas Wren's funeral, the investigation took an even darker turn. Sheriff Caldwell knew finding a body was just the beginning. He ordered intensive searches of all ravines, valleys, and remote areas near where Thomas was found. Dozens of volunteers joined the effort, trekking perilous trails and exploring every cave, crevice, and hidden corner of those unforgiving mountains. The expectation was to find more bodies, but weeks of searching yielded nothing. Neither Martha nor the children were found. It was as if they had simply evaporated after Thomas's death. The absence of other bodies raised new theories. Some began to believe that perhaps Martha and the children were still alive, taken away, sold into forced labor, or held hostage in some even more remote place. At the turn of the 20th century, stories of families disappearing on the American frontier were not uncommon. There were reports of women and children being taken west to territories where the law barely reached, forced to live under false identities. The idea was disturbing, but it offered a cruel hope that perhaps they were not dead. The sheriff began investigating this possibility. He sent detailed descriptions of Martha and the children to authorities in neighboring states, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, even Ohio and Indiana received telegrams with information about the missing family. He asked them to be on the lookout for any woman with 4 children who had suddenly appeared in their communities with no clear explanation of origin. Some leads came in over the next few months, but none led to Martha Wren. There were false sightings, cases of mistaken identity, hopes that quickly shattered upon investigation. Meanwhile, the search for James Ridgway continued. Sheriff Caldwell was convinced this man held the answers. If anyone knew what had really happened to the Wrens, it was him. But Ridgway was a ghost. Even with a reward offered for his capture, no one could locate him. It was rumored he had left North Carolina altogether, fleeing to deep Tennessee, or even crossing into Arkansas territory. Others said he was dead, the victim of an internal dispute within his own gang. Without concrete evidence, Ridgway remained a shadow, an almost mythical figure of evil haunting nightly conversations. In the summer of 1926, an unexpected clue emerged. A traveling merchant moving between small Appalachian towns came to the sheriff with an intriguing story. He said that months earlier, during the harsh winter, he had taken shelter in a tavern near the Tennessee border. There, he overheard two men speaking quietly about a job that had gone wrong. They mentioned a family, talked about someone named Thomas, who had tried to deceive them, and discussed how things had spiraled out of control. The merchant hadn't thought much of it at the time, but upon learning about the Wrens, he sensed a possible connection. Caldwell questioned the merchant intensely. Could he recall what the men looked like? The merchant described one as around 40 years old, with a gray beard and a scar running from his left eye to his chin, a description matching James Ridgway perfectly. The other was younger, perhaps 25, with red hair and a sturdy build. The merchant remembered they seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the door as if expecting trouble. When they realized someone might be listening, they lowered their voices further and soon left without finishing their drinks. The sheriff immediately set out for that town with 3 armed men. The tavern was still there, a decaying establishment on the edge of a dusty road. The owner, an elderly, stern man, was initially reluctant to talk, but when Caldwell explained the gravity of the situation and hinted that obstructing an investigation could bring trouble, the man opened up. Yes, he knew the 2 men. They had appeared occasionally during the winter. They always paid in silver coins, never stayed long, and never gave names. But the tavern owner knew where they often went, an abandoned sawmill about 5 miles into the mountains. Some had seen smoke rising from there during the winter. The abandoned sawmill lay in a secluded valley surrounded by dense pines, accessible only by a precarious road. When the sheriff and his men arrived, the place appeared long deserted. The wooden structures were rotting, covered in moss and vines, but there were recent signs of occupation. Boot prints in the dry mud, ashes from a campfire inside the main building, and, more significantly, hoof prints leading into the forest. Someone had definitely been there, and not long ago. They followed the tracks cautiously through the dense woods. The trail meandered for about 2 miles before disappearing into a stream. Caldwell ordered the men to split into pairs and search both banks. It was during this search that one of his men made a chilling discovery. Hanging from a low branch, partially hidden by foliage, was a piece of cloth, a child's handkerchief delicately embroidered with yellow flowers. The sheriff recognized the pattern immediately. Martha Wren used to make handkerchiefs just like that for her daughters. He had seen Emma wearing an identical one during church services. The discovery reignited the search with fierce intensity. If that handkerchief belonged to Emma, it meant she had been in that area at some point. But when? And was she alive? The men scoured every inch of the surroundings, finding the remains of a makeshift camp. Marks where a tent or shelter had been pitched, empty food cans, and something that made Caldwell's heart stop, small footprints in the hardened mud, clearly from children. But there was also something more sinister. Dark spots on the ground that looked like blood. It wasn't much, but enough to suggest violence had occurred there. The sheriff collected samples of the soil and the objects. He knew he was treading into dangerous territory. If Ridgway and his men had indeed held Martha and the children hostage, there was no guarantee they had been treated humanely. The criminals of that era had no scruples. Women and children were often the most vulnerable victims. The investigation had now been ongoing for over a year. The autumn of 1926 was approaching, and the sheriff's frustration was palpable. He had invested countless hours, traveled hundreds of miles, and interviewed dozens of people. He had fragments of evidence, clues leading to more clues, but no definitive answers. Where were Martha, Sarah, Jacob, Emma, and Samuel? Were they alive or dead? If dead, where were their bodies? If alive, why hadn't they tried to return or send word? The community, too, was exhausted. The Wren mystery had consumed so much time and emotional energy that many simply wanted to move on. Some families began avoiding mention of the case, as if silence could lighten the weight of not knowing. The Wren house, once a home full of life, stood empty, its curtainless windows staring at the road like vacant eyes. No one wanted to buy the property. People said the land was cursed, a place where an entire family had vanished, leaving only unanswered questions and shadows that refused to fade. Reverend Stone continued to include the Wren family in his prayers each service. He refused to relinquish hope, even as it grew increasingly tenuous. In his sermons, he spoke of faith during impossible times, of holding on to belief even when the world seemed cruel and meaningless. But even his voice carried a weight of fatigue. He had visibly aged since the nightmare began. His hair had turned completely white, and deep wrinkles lined his face. The Wren case had not only taken a family from his congregation, it had stolen something deeper from the entire community. In early 1927, more than a year after the Wren's disappearance, something extraordinary happened. A letter arrived at Sheriff Caldwell's office. It had no return address, only a blurred postmark indicating it had been sent from somewhere in Tennessee. The letter was brief, written in a childish, trembling hand. "My name is Sarah. I'm alive. They separated us. I don't know where my mother and brothers are. Please help me. I'm on a farm near Knoxville. The man who brought me here calls me by another name. I'm afraid." The letter offered no further details, no specific address, no direct way to trace it. Caldwell read and reread those words with shaking hands. Was this truly Sarah Wren, or a cruel hoax? Someone trying to manipulate the investigation or extort money? He showed the letter to several people who knew Sarah, including Reverend Stone and teachers from the church school. They all agreed the handwriting could be hers. Sarah had been 16 when she disappeared, and her writing had always been delicate and slightly irregular, much like the script in the letter. Certain details in how words were formed seemed too authentic to be fabricated. The sheriff wasted no time. He immediately sent telegrams to authorities in and around Knoxville, requesting they investigate any farm where a young woman of about 17 or 18 was living under suspicious circumstances. Knoxville and its environs were vast, with hundreds of farms scattered across hills and valleys. It would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, but it was the first concrete clue about a possible living member of the Wren family in over a year. Caldwell could not ignore it. While awaiting replies from Tennessee, the sheriff decided to investigate the letter further. He took it to a document specialist in a larger city, a man who performed handwriting analysis for courts. The expert examined the letter under bright light with a magnifying glass. His conclusion was cautious, but encouraging. The writing showed signs of tension and haste, as if written in secret or under fear of discovery. Variations in pen pressure suggested the writer was emotionally distressed. There were no obvious signs of forgery, though absolute certainty was impossible. Back in the community, word of the letter spread quickly. Reactions were mixed. Some felt hopeful, believing a positive outcome was finally possible. Others were skeptical, noting that fraud was not uncommon in that era. People often exploited others' tragedies for attention or money. Reverend Stone, however, chose to believe. During the next service, he announced there was hope Sarah was alive. He asked the congregation to pray for her safety and for the success of the search. The church, which had been somber for so many months, suddenly filled with a different energy, not quite joy, but something akin to cautious relief. 3 weeks passed before a response arrived from Tennessee. The sheriff of a county near Knoxville reported investigating several farms and finding a suspicious situation. An isolated property belonging to a man named Elias Drummond, who lived alone, but had recently been seen with a young woman he claimed was his niece, said to have come from another state to help with farm chores. Neighbors found it strange, as Drummond had never mentioned having family before. The young woman was rarely seen, and when she did appear, she seemed frightened and avoided eye contact. Caldwell immediately left for Tennessee. He took 2 trusted men and asked Reverend Stone to accompany them in case the young woman truly was Sarah. The journey took 2 days, crossing mountains and valleys, along precarious roads, winding through rocks and ravines. Upon reaching Knoxville, they met with the local sheriff, a man named Porter Hayes, who led them to Elias Drummond's farm. The place stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by unkempt fields and dense forest. The house was modest, built of weathered planks with an irregularly tiled roof. A barn stood nearby, with chickens scratching in the yard. As the group approached, a man emerged from the house. Elias Drummond was about 50, thin, with suspicious eyes. He demanded to know what they wanted, his voice thick with irritation. Sheriff Hayes explained they were investigating a family's disappearance and needed to speak with the young woman living with him. Drummond immediately grew defensive, insisting she was his niece, there legally, and that nothing suspicious was happening. But Caldwell was not interested in arguments. He demanded to see the young woman in person. Drummond hesitated, but seeing he was surrounded by 4 determined men, he relented. He called toward the house, and after a few moments, a young woman appeared in the doorway. She was thin, with dark hair falling messily over her shoulders. Her clothes were simple and worn, but when she looked up and saw Reverend Stone, her face transformed completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she whispered a single word: "Reverend." It was Sarah Wren. There was no doubt. The Reverend rushed to her, and the young woman collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Minutes of pure emotion followed. Caldwell felt a tightness in his chest. After so long, so much effort, so many disappointments, here was a survivor. Sarah was alive. Drummond tried to protest, claiming he had paid for her and had documents proving she was his legitimate maid, but his words fell on deaf ears. Sheriff Hayes immediately arrested him for kidnapping and human trafficking. Sarah was in shock. She could barely speak coherently for the first few hours. Reverend Stone took her to a hotel in Knoxville, where she was fed and given clean clothes. Only after resting and feeling safe did she begin to tell her story. A tale even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. She confirmed her father, Thomas, had been involved with dangerous men. She recounted how, one night in October 1925, armed men had arrived at their home. They demanded Thomas take them to a hiding place where money was kept. Thomas tried to negotiate, offering to give up everything if they left his family alone, but the men didn't trust him. They forced the entire family to go along, using them as collateral. They were taken to the mountain cabin, the same one found during the investigation. Sarah remembered terrifying days there, with her mother trying to keep the children calm, while the men argued about what to do with them. Thomas was forced to reveal where he had hidden some of the stolen goods, and to give information about others in the criminal network. But something went wrong. A dispute erupted among the criminals themselves. One wanted to kill the whole family to eliminate witnesses. Another argued they could be sold or used otherwise. In the chaos of that argument, Thomas tried to flee with his family. It was night, and they managed to slip out of the cabin while the men were distracted, but they didn't get far. The criminals quickly caught up. Sarah remembered gunshots, screams running through the dark woods. Her father yelled for everyone to scatter, thinking it would be harder to capture them that way. It was the last time she saw any member of her family. She ran alone through the woods, stumbling over roots and rocks, until one of the men finally caught her. He dragged her back, but, to her surprise, did not kill her. Instead, he sold her to Elias Drummond a few weeks later. Sarah explained she had been held in various places in the weeks after her capture, first in a different cabin, then in an abandoned barn, always under watch. The men constantly argued about what to do with her. One of them, whom she believed from description to be James Ridgway, spoke of selling her to someone needing labor. She was young, healthy, and could work for years at the cost of only basic sustenance. That was how she ended up with Elias Drummond, who paid an unknown sum for her. Drummond treated her as property, forcing her to work on the farm from dawn to dusk. During her months there, Sarah attempted escape 3 times. The first time, she barely left the property before Drummond caught her and locked her in the barn for a week as punishment. The second attempt, she reached the main road, but with no idea where to go, was easily recaptured. Only on the third try did she manage to steal pen and paper while Drummond was in town. She wrote that desperate letter and convinced a passing traveler to mail it, begging him to help. The man, moved by her despair, kept his word. But Sarah knew nothing of the fate of her mother or siblings. The last image she had of them was in the dark forest that terrible night, all running in different directions as gunshots echoed through the trees. She did not know if they had been captured, if they had escaped, or if they were alive or dead. The pain in her eyes as she recounted this was devastating. Reverend Stone held her hand and promised they would not rest until they uncovered the truth about Martha, Jacob, Emma, and Samuel. Sarah only nodded, but it was clear she had already relinquished any hope of reuniting with her family. Sheriff Caldwell now had an eyewitness. Sarah could identify the men involved, describe the locations where she had been held, and provide crucial information that had, until then, been mere speculation. He spent days interviewing her carefully, taking detailed notes of every word. Sarah described 3 main men: the leader, whom she believed to be Ridgway, tall with a facial scar and a rough voice; another with red hair and a strong build, who seemed to be Ridgway's right-hand man; and a third, younger man, perhaps in his 20s, who appeared uncomfortable with the situation and sometimes showed something resembling remorse. With these descriptions, Caldwell began constructing a more complete profile of the gang. He worked with artists to create sketches based on Sarah's recollections. These sketches were distributed to sheriffs across 5 states. The bounty for James Ridgway's capture was significantly increased. Newspapers throughout the region ran stories about the Wren case, now with the dramatic angle of a rescued survivor. The story captured the public's imagination. Letters arrived offering information, most useless, but some contained promising details. Meanwhile, Sarah was brought back to North Carolina. The community received her with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy that she was alive, sorrow for the vivid reminder of all that had been lost. The Wren house remained empty, but women from the church cleaned and prepared it in case Sarah wished to live there again. She hesitated, the memories of that place too heavy. Eventually, she decided to stay with a family in the congregation, the Pattersons, who had a daughter her age and offered to take her in as their own. Sarah slowly began rebuilding her life. She returned to church, though at first she could barely attend services without breaking into tears. The trauma was deeply engraved. She suffered constant nightmares, waking screaming in the night, imagining the men had returned to capture her. Mrs. Patterson sat with her during these terrible nights, holding her hand and softly singing hymns until she calmed. It was a slow, painful healing process. Yet there was also a fierce determination in Sarah. She wanted those responsible captured and punished. She wanted answers about her family. In conversations with Sheriff Caldwell, she recalled more details. She described the approximate route they were forced to take the night they were taken from home, remembering a specific stream and a steep hill with a fallen tree blocking part of the path. Using this information, Caldwell organized new expeditions to retrace that route and find further evidence. During one such expedition in the spring of 1927, they made a disturbing discovery. Following Sarah's directions, they found an area of dense forest, showing clear signs of a past struggle. Broken branches, deep marks in the earth, as if someone had been dragged, and dark spots on the ground that later tests confirmed as human blood. But the most shocking find was partially buried under leaves and branches about 50 yards away. A small child's boot, the kind young boys wore, and inside it, tiny bones still in place. The discovery was devastating. The sheriff immediately expanded the search. For 3 days, dozens of men dug, searched, and sifted the soil. They found more remains, small bones, scattered over an area of about 100 yards, partially buried and dispersed by animals. Over the months, they also discovered deteriorated clothing, buttons, and fabric fragments. It appeared at least one of the Wren children had died there in that forest on that terrible night. But which one? And where were the others? Sarah was spared from seeing the remains directly, but was informed of the discovery. She collapsed upon hearing the news. For days, she was in shock, unable to eat or speak. Reverend Stone spent hours by her side, praying and offering what little comfort he could. The entire community felt the weight of this confirmation, not just another death, but its brutality. One child, perhaps 7-year-old Samuel or 13-year-old Jacob, had been killed and left in the woods like an animal. The cruelty was unbearable. The remains were carefully collected and examined. A local doctor tried to determine the age and cause of death, but after so long, and with the remains so scattered, absolute certainty was impossible. He confirmed they belonged to a child between 7 and 15, with signs of bone trauma consistent with violence. A funeral was arranged, though it was unknown exactly which Wren child was being buried. The small coffin was lowered into the ground as the entire community wept. Sarah stood there, supported by the Pattersons, her face a mask of indescribable pain. After the funeral, the search for the other family members intensified. If one child had been killed there, where were Martha, Jacob, and Emma? Or if the remains belonged to Jacob or Emma, where was Samuel? All possibilities were horrible. Caldwell barely slept anymore, consumed by the need for answers. He sent men to scour every inch of the forest and surrounding areas. They found more evidence of temporary camps and signs of violence, but no other bodies. Then, news arrived from Tennessee. A man had been arrested after a tavern brawl in a small mountain town. During his arrest, he was found with stolen goods, and when interrogated, began talking in exchange for clemency. He admitted to being part of a gang operating in the region, and mentioned knowing James Ridgway. He said Ridgway had left Tennessee months earlier, fleeing to Arkansas after problems with a family that caused significant trouble. The man didn't know specifics, but confirmed there had been an incident involving hostages that went badly wrong, and Ridgway feared capture. Sheriff Caldwell left for Tennessee immediately. The arrested man, who identified himself as Clayton Marsh, was in his 30s and appeared to have lived a hard life in the mountains. He was willing to cooperate, but his information was fragmented and not always reliable. Marsh admitted to participating in some robberies organized by Ridgway, but swore he was never involved in murders. He said the gang generally avoided extreme violence to avoid drawing authorities' attention. But something had changed with the Wren case. According to Marsh, Thomas Wren had become a problem. He knew too much about the gang's operations, the hiding places, and the buyers of stolen goods. When Thomas tried to exit the scheme, Ridgway saw it as a threat. The decision to kidnap the entire family was meant to ensure Thomas's silence. But things spiraled out of control that night in the woods. Marsh wasn't present, but heard accounts from other members. There were gunshots, panic, and in the ensuing chaos, people died. Ridgway was furious, as this hadn't been the plan. Caldwell pressed Marsh for more details. How many people died that night? Marsh wasn't sure. He'd heard that at least 2 or 3 members of the Wren family were killed during the escape, but there were also contradictory rumors that some had been captured alive and sold, as happened with Sarah. The gang panicked after that night. Some members left the region immediately. Others stayed, but kept an extremely low profile. Ridgway, as the leader and most wanted, eventually fled west with loyal men and as much accumulated valuables as he could carry. The sheriff asked specifically about Martha Wren. Marsh hesitated before answering. He said he'd heard the woman had been separated from the children after capture. Some gang members wanted to sell her. Others thought she knew too much and should be eliminated. Marsh didn't know the final decision, but recalled heated discussions on the subject. He mentioned a name that caught Caldwell's attention: Cyrus Blackwood. According to Marsh, this man usually negotiated the sale of people for forced labor. If Martha had been sold, Blackwood would have arranged it. Cyrus Blackwood was a new name to Caldwell. He began investigating, sending telegrams to authorities in several states. Weeks later, he discovered Blackwood was known in criminal circles as a middleman, not a direct thief or killer, but a connector between those needing illegal workers and those who could provide them. It was a dark, brutal, yet surprisingly common trade in remote parts of the United States at that time. Blackwood operated primarily between Tennessee, Arkansas, and Missouri. The search for Blackwood became a priority. If he had negotiated Martha Wren's sale, he could lead the sheriff to her. But finding Blackwood proved as difficult as finding Ridgway. He had no fixed address, traveled constantly, and used false names. Caldwell collaborated with sheriffs across multiple states, creating a network of informants to alert if Blackwood was spotted. Months passed with little news. The summer of 1927 was especially frustrating. Every clue seemed to lead to a dead end. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her difficult recovery. She began helping at the church school, teaching younger children to read and write. The work gave her purpose, a way to keep her mind occupied. But the shadows of the past never fully left. She was now 17, a young woman who should have been considering marriage and her future. Yet she carried traumas that made her seem decades older. Reverend Stone worried constantly, seeing in her both extraordinary strength and a fragility that could one day break her completely. In the autumn of that year, exactly 2 years after the Wren's initial disappearance, there was a significant development. A bounty hunter tracking James Ridgway found his trail in Arkansas. Ridgway had been seen in a town called Fort Smith, near the border with Indian Territory. The bounty hunter, an experienced man named Nathaniel Cross, sent word to Sheriff Caldwell. However, by the time local authorities arrived at the location, Ridgway was already gone, always one step ahead, always slipping through Justice's fingers. Yet in Fort Smith, Caldwell managed to interview people who had interacted with Ridgway. A merchant recalled that Ridgway was with another man, the red-haired one Sarah had described. They had bought provisions for a long journey and inquired about routes to Texas. This information was valuable. If Ridgway was heading to Texas, he was moving into territory where it would be even harder to reach him. Texas was vast, wild, and the law was spotty at best. Caldwell faced a difficult decision. He could not pursue Ridgway personally indefinitely. His responsibilities as sheriff of his North Carolina county did not allow prolonged absences. He needed to rely on others to continue the hunt. He worked with the federal marshal responsible for the region, sharing all his information. The Wren case officially became a federal investigation due to human trafficking across state lines. This brought more resources, but also more bureaucracy. As the hunt for Ridgway continued elsewhere, Caldwell focused on finding Cyrus Blackwood. He finally succeeded at the end of 1927. Blackwood was located in a small Missouri town using the false name Charles Burton. He was arrested in a coordinated operation involving sheriffs from 3 counties. Confronted with evidence and the possibility of multiple federal charges, Blackwood began to negotiate. He admitted to participating in the sale of several people over the years, including members of the Wren family. Blackwood confirmed he had negotiated Sarah's sale to Elias Drummond. Then he revealed something that made Caldwell's heart race. He had also negotiated the sale of another woman and a small child that Ridgway had brought him around the same time. The description matched Martha Wren and possibly 10-year-old Emma. They had been sold together to a farmer in southern Missouri who needed help on his property. Caldwell demanded the buyer's name and location. Blackwood hesitated, knowing this information was his only bargaining chip. Eventually, after assurances of a reduced sentence, he revealed it. The man's name was Jeremiah Colton, and his farm was near a town called Poplar Bluff in Butler County, Missouri. Caldwell immediately sent telegrams to local authorities, asking them to investigate, but he didn't wait for replies. Along with Reverend Stone and 2 other men, he left for Missouri at once. If Martha and Emma were truly there, he needed to see them with his own eyes. The journey to Poplar Bluff took almost a week. They traveled by train when possible, by wagon when necessary, through landscapes shifting from mountains to plains. Upon arriving in Butler County, they met with the local sheriff, William Tucker. Tucker knew Jeremiah Colton, who owned a medium-sized farm growing cotton and corn. Colton had a reputation for being difficult, but there were no formal complaints against him. Tucker agreed to accompany Caldwell to the property. Colton's farm lay at the end of a dusty road, surrounded by sprawling fields. The main house was a 2-story, well-built but unadorned structure, with a large barn and several smaller outbuildings scattered around. When the group arrived, Jeremiah Colton came out to meet them. He was a robust man, around 45, with a suspicious expression. He demanded to know what North Carolina men wanted on his property. Sheriff Tucker explained they were investigating a human trafficking case and had information that Colton had purchased workers from illegal sources. Colton immediately became defensive, insisting everyone on his farm worked legally, received fair wages, and that he knew nothing about trafficking. But his body language suggested otherwise. He was nervous, constantly glancing back as if checking for listeners. Caldwell, experienced in interrogations, sensed his unease. He told Colton it would be better to cooperate, as lying would lead to severe consequences. Colton hesitated, then finally admitted that yes, he had purchased 2 female workers a few years earlier from a man who hadn't given his real name, but he believed he was acquiring legally contracted services. Caldwell asked to see the 2 women immediately. Colton led the group to a smaller building at the back of the property, a simple cabin with weathered wooden walls and a single small window. He knocked on the door and called out loudly. After a few moments, the door opened slowly, and a woman appeared. She appeared to be around 40, but was painfully thin with hair that had gone gray despite her relatively young age. Her clothes were patched many times over, and her hands showed deep calluses from years of hard labor. When she saw the unfamiliar men, her face filled with instant fear. Reverend Stone stepped forward, his voice soft and reassuring. He spoke her name, Martha Wren. The woman went completely still, as if struck by lightning. Her eyes widened, and she began to tremble. Tears streamed down her cheeks before she could utter a word. She nodded slowly, unable to form any sound. It was her. After 2 years of searching, uncertainty, and fear, Martha Wren had been found. The Reverend approached and wrapped her in an embrace. Martha collapsed completely, sobbing so intensely her whole body shook. But there was someone else. Caldwell asked about the child. Still trembling, Martha pointed into the hut. There, huddled on a thin mattress in the corner, was a girl of about 12. She looked at the strangers with terrified eyes, like a cornered animal. The sheriff recognized her immediately from the description. It was Emma Wren. The girl who had been 10 when she disappeared was now 12, but she seemed to have aged far beyond her years. Her face was pale, her thin arms showing marks of hard labor. She said nothing, just looked at her mother, as if asking permission to trust these men. Martha finally managed to speak. Her voice was hoarse, broken by years of enforced silence and trauma. She explained that after that terrible night in the woods, she and Emma had been captured. The men separated them from the others, and she never learned what happened to Jacob and Samuel. She had begged for days, asking countless times about her children, but never received answers. Eventually, she and Emma were sold to Colton, who forced them to work in the fields from dawn to dusk. They were kept in that hut, fed minimally, and forbidden from leaving the property or speaking to strangers. Martha asked about Thomas and Sarah, her voice filled with desperate hope. Reverend Stone took her hands and, in a gentle voice, told her the truth. Thomas was dead. His body had been found in the mountains. But Sarah was alive and safe in North Carolina, waiting for her. The news brought a mixture of relief and devastating pain. Martha wept for the husband she would never see again, but thanked God that Sarah had survived. As for Jacob and Samuel, no one had answers. Martha clung to a fragile hope that perhaps, somehow, her sons were also alive somewhere. Jeremiah Colton was arrested immediately. He protested, claiming he did not know the women were kidnapping victims and that he had paid in good faith for contract workers. But his claims convinced no one. Sheriff Tucker took him into custody, while Caldwell attended to Martha and Emma. The two were in a state of shock, barely able to process that they were truly being freed. They had lost hope so long ago that freedom felt unreal, like a dream from which they might wake at any moment. The journey back to North Carolina was slow and careful. Martha and Emma needed time to recover physically and emotionally. They stopped in several towns along the way, where they were properly fed and examined by doctors, who confirmed severe malnutrition and signs of prolonged physical abuse. Emma spoke very little, and only to her mother. Trauma had stolen her childhood completely. Martha tried to be strong, but often broke down in tears, especially when thinking of Jacob and Samuel. By the time they finally reached North Carolina, word had already spread. The entire community gathered to welcome Martha and Emma. But the most significant moment came when Sarah saw them. The three women ran toward each other, embracing and crying in a way that broke the hearts of all who witnessed it. They were three survivors of an indescribable nightmare, reunited after years of separation and suffering. Yet their joy was tinged with profound sadness. Thomas was dead. Jacob and Samuel remained missing. The Wren family had been torn apart in a way that could never be fully repaired. Martha, Sarah, and Emma moved into a small house provided by the congregation. The community mobilized to help them, offering food, clothing, and furniture. Reverend Stone visited almost daily, providing both spiritual and practical support, but recovery was slow and painful. Martha suffered constant nightmares. Emma startled at any sudden sound. Sarah, already grappling with her own trauma, now also bore the weight of caring for her mother and sister, a heavy responsibility for someone so young. The investigation into Jacob and Samuel continued. Caldwell did not give up. He pressed Clayton Marsh and Cyrus Blackwood for any information about the two boys. Marsh finally revealed something he had withheld. He had heard that one of the children, a boy of about 13, had been sold to work in the coal mines of eastern Kentucky. Mines often used child labor, especially in narrow tunnels where adults couldn't fit. It was brutal and dangerous work, but common at the time. Caldwell sent investigators to Kentucky, focusing on mining regions. They visited dozens of mines, interviewed hundreds of workers, and showed descriptions of Jacob Wren. There were a few reports of boys matching the description, but none could be confirmed as Jacob. Mines were places where identities were easily lost. Boys were registered under false names or simply as numbers. Many died in accidents and were buried without ceremony. It was a brutal reality that made the search nearly impossible. As for Samuel, the youngest, only 7 when he disappeared, the possibilities were even bleaker. Children that young were the most vulnerable. They could have been sold to families for cheap labor, forced to beg on city streets, or simply may not have survived that terrible night in the woods. The remains found in the forest were never definitively identified as belonging to Samuel or Jacob. There remained a torturous possibility that either might still be alive, but also the devastating probability that both were dead. As 1928 progressed, the case began to cool again. James Ridgway was never captured. Occasional rumors surfaced of sightings in Texas, then New Mexico, always on the run, always one step ahead. The red-haired man Sarah had identified as Ridgway's right-hand man also remained at large. Some minor gang members were arrested and convicted, but those most responsible for the Wren's fate had escaped justice. Martha tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life for her daughters. She found work sewing for families in the community. Sarah continued teaching at the church school. Emma slowly began to interact a little more with other children, though she always remained in the shadows, never fully present. The 3 attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew they had occupied when the family was whole. The empty space beside them was a constant reminder of Thomas, Jacob, and Samuel. The following years were marked by a melancholy stillness in the lives of the Wren women. Martha aged rapidly, as if the weight of her experiences had accelerated time within her. Her hair turned completely white, and her hands, scarred by forced labor, trembled as she tried to sew on cold nights. She never stopped searching for Jacob and Samuel. Every traveler passing through the region was questioned. Every report of a found child in another state was investigated, but answers never came. Sarah, by age 20, had grown into a young woman of extraordinary strength. Though her smile rarely reached her eyes, she continued to dedicate her life to teaching the community's children, finding purpose in helping other families keep their children safe and educated. Some local young men showed interest, but she gently refused. The shadows of the past were company enough. Emma grew up in silence, an almost ghostly presence in the house. She learned sewing from her mother, but rarely spoke of what she had endured. It was as if part of her had been left behind on that Missouri farm. Reverend Stone continued to visit the 3 until his final days. When he passed away in 1910, it was Martha who held his hand on his deathbed, thanking him for never giving up on them. Stone had been more than a spiritual leader. He had been the anchor that kept this shattered family from being completely lost to the darkness. His successor continued to include the names of Jacob and Samuel in church prayers, keeping alive the memory of the boys who never returned home. The original Wren house stood empty for decades. No one wanted to buy it, and it eventually began to crumble. The planks rotted, the roof partially collapsed, and nature slowly reclaimed the space. It became a haunted place in the local imagination, an unintentional monument to life's fragility and the cruelty that can lurk in the shadows of even the most beautiful mountains. Children in the region were warned not to approach, not out of fear of ghosts, but because of the profound sadness the place carried. Martha Wren died in 1917, taking with her the hope she had never fully abandoned of being reunited with her children. She was buried beside Thomas in a simple, deeply felt ceremony. Sarah and Emma remained together, caring for each other through the years that followed. They never left that small Appalachian community. It was as if they were trapped there, waiting for something they knew would never come. The Wren case challenged not only the local church, but the entire notion of security and trust that community had built. It revealed how even in the smallest and most devout congregations, terrible secrets could hide. It showed how need and desperation could lead good people to impossible choices. And most of all, it demonstrated how human evil can destroy lives in ways that echo through generations. To this day, the fate of Jacob and Samuel Wren remains unknown. There are no marked graves for them, no certainty about where or how their lives ended. They exist only in the memories recorded in old county documents, in letters preserved by the church, and in the stories still told in the mountains of North Carolina about the family that disappeared on an autumn night in 1925. The mountains keep their secrets well, and perhaps some mysteries are never meant to be fully solved. What remains are lessons about vigilance, about protecting the vulnerable, about never assuming we fully know the lives of those around us. The Wren story is a grim reminder that even in communities of faith and apparent peace, darkness can enter without warning, taking with it all we hold dear. If this story has touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Share your reflections on this disturbing case in the comments and suggest other historical mysteries you would like to see explored. Every story told here is a fragment of American history that deserves to be remembered, no matter how painful. Until the next journey through the shadows.